TCI as a senior programs manager and as an and have been the member of TCI since 2015. TCI is an independent and global organization of persons with psychosocial disabilities. TCI works with its national leaders and members to enhance their movements at the national level and provides a platform to advocate with the governments for inclusion through our different programs, micro grants, trainings, and DPO support grants. There are many countries where movements of persons with psychosocial disabilities don't exist. Even if they do, they are very, you can say, medical model. And to counter this, our fellowship program has been really successful in terms of supporting the national leaders for forming their own national DPOs and establish a momentum in the country for the rights of persons with psychosocial disabilities. Persons with mental, intellectual, multiple, and psychosocial disabilities, users and survivors of psychiatry, and those with intersectional neurodiversional identities are still left behind in the context of the human rights and inclusion. This series of webinars is a unique opportunity for all of us and will create a platform for all of us to initiate a dialogue between multiple stakeholders and conclude with the concrete solutions for deinstitutionalization and inclusion of persons with disabilities who continue to face exclusion from the society. I now request Ms. Bhargavi Dawar to take the floor and introduce the program and speakers in detail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Waqar, for that quick introduction to TCI. Really honored to be here with TCI. Been with TCI since the last 2 years as its director. It's been a pleasure to see TCI grow from strength to strength through the strengths of our members in different countries and the strengths of our partners who are here today. And I would like to mention, of course, IDA, the International Disability Alliance, Inclusion International. We've been with the topic of deinstitutionalization since long, and definitely through every conference of state parties meeting. Validity Foundation, the Indonesian Mental Health Association, a longtime member of TCI and a dear partner, Disability Rights Fund, and Center for Inclusive Policy. Thank you all for joining us in this mandate for deinstitutionalization. Many of you will be aware of the CRPD committee works on deinstitutionalization, a very welcome move, which we hope will also build up the momentum within the UN human rights systems, which the momentum began last year itself or a few years before with the general comment on living independently, the mental health and human rights resolutions, the special rapporteur reports, the shocking findings during COVID times, and all of that. So many of you will be aware of and have contributed to those initiatives. So we welcome this initiative at the United Nations level very much. And many different initiatives are on to contribute to that. Why TCI is doing this along with our partners? Because we would like to bring some advocacy news and some advocacy thinking to the national members, to other CSOs, to various DPOs who are deeply concerned about the fact that despite so many years of the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, institutions continue to exist, perhaps not in its original form, but in many, many new virulent variations. And therefore, it's important that we address this, not just in specific locations, but in all universal locations where advocacy initiatives for the rights of persons with disabilities are being conducted. We particularly appeal to all TCI members and to partners networks to take up this issue in the coming year. That momentum is so important. The World Mental Health Day is also very important to TCI, and every year TCI runs a campaign to give voice to persons with psychosocial disabilities to express what we need. And in a way, we want to reclaim the Mental Health Day as our day, where we assert our rights in the way that we want to define it. So it's called the hashtag What We Need campaign. We run it from this coming week onwards until the Human Rights Day in December. And this year, it's the de-institutionalization theme, which seems to be the topic for the year in different spaces. And we will express these through these webinars and some blog articles and so on and so forth. We welcome you into the campaign as well. So that is the context for these webinars. There are 4 of them spread from now until December. It hopes to build on the de-institutionalization momentum. We are concerned to imagine together, if not share, practices of what we would like to see if those institutions, closed-door institutions, custodial institutions, mental health institutions, whatever form and whatever size and shape, if those did not exist, what would happen? What kind of world would it be? What would we like to see? What do we need in communities for the process and the lives of persons with disabilities to be safe and CRPD realized? So we welcome you to these webinars. Thank you for joining us. And so the agenda was shared, but just a quick run through. We have speakers from Inclusion International, the International Disability Alliance, MIASA. We have some grassroots views from MIASA, Malaysia, IMHA, Indonesia, and Kami from South Korea, representative of low-income countries, low-middle-income countries, as well as high-income countries. Then we have Validity Foundation and a little bit of time for question answers. We request that all question answers be posted in the chat box, and we will try as far as possible to pick up those questions. Please do address your questions to the speakers. We do have captioning services as well as sign language interpretation. The program is also cast on our YouTube channel, and the recording will be available for those who might have liked to attend but were not able to. I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Manal Miri from Inclusion International. She's a human rights officer for Inclusion International. She's based in Tunisia. She's a family member of a young man with autism. She has a master's degree on international and comparative disability law and policy. Her focus was on persons with intellectual disabilities and Article 19 in the Tunisian context. Over to you, Manal. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Bhargavi. Thank you for the introduction and for inviting us. We are very happy to again partner and collaborate together on a webinar on this topic, on this important topic. So let me just start with a couple of words to introduce Inclusion International. So we are the global network of persons with intellectual disabilities and families. We have been fighting for de-institutionalization and inclusion in the community for many years. We were strongly involved in the CRPD negotiations of Article 19, mainly through Robert Martin, who was at that time a council member of Inclusion International. We have also published a global report on Article 19, which shows the work of our network, the importance, how it is implemented throughout the world, how support, choice, and inclusion works in different contexts. And we have a lot of members who have been directly involved in the DI process in their countries, such as in Canada, the US, New Zealand. So today I will mainly refer to the work that our network have been done in these different countries and some of the evaluation or recommendation they made for future GI processes. So let me start with what would be the prerequisite for successful deinstitutionalization. First thing is the political will. There won't be any deinstitutionalization process that can success without a real political will. And this should be publicly announced. Then the legal reform. We know that without legal capacity and if people with intellectual disabilities are not recognized before the law, they won't be able to exercise their rights. They won't be able to own their home, to have a bank account, and other rights that will allow them to live independently in the community. The policy commitments are very important. There should be a shift of public policy to community living. So all different policies, including social protection, housing policies, employment, and others. There should be a plan to create community services and support services in the community should be made available. Another important point is the preparation of families. We will discuss more about this point, but we know around the world, and we heard from our members that in most countries, families are the main places where persons with intellectual disabilities live. And the last but not least, we need to consider in every DI process, persons with disabilities should be considered at the center of the process. So some key elements of successful deinstitutionalization, these have been identified by a report or very good document developed by Inclusion Canada and People First Canada, which is called The Right Way. I can add the link to this document later on in the chat box. But they have identified key elements. I won't cite them all. They talk about 10 key elements, but I will present some of these briefly. So first element that should happen is to identify and involve what they call champions, who are allies. And these people has to be from different sectors. It can be volunteers, it can be advocacy organizations, it can be from government, political parties, it can be family members, it can be staff from the institutions themselves, and mainly persons with disabilities. These champions will help a lot in the implementation and in the success of the DI process. Second key element is to focus on each individual plans rather than emptying out and closing the institution. Again, it's a prerequisite, but it's a very important element of the DI process. So the person-centered plans should focus on the person's preferences and needs. And we have to consider that it's an individualized approach, that we are thinking about the person first. What are their interests? What are their preferences? What are their needs? And build the closure or the move from the institution to the community based on the person's plans. So therefore, we need to consider a diversity of support services and models. Some would need 24/7 support, and some others would need punctual support community-based, can be through community-based services, it can be through individualized budgets and others. And it's also important to consider the support for families. Again, because many persons with intellectual disabilities who will leave the institutions will come back in their families. So therefore, the third key element is to involve families in all the process. It's really important to explain the GI process to families and reassure them. They have always been advised and recommended by professionals that this is the best place for their relatives, that institutions are the best, the most safest place, and where they can really receive all the support that they need. Therefore, it's really important to involve them and involve them in the full process. They have a role in the development of individualized plan because in many cases, they are the best source of information about the person, and they would know the circle of support that exists, the families that they have there, and they will help in identifying what are their different relationships. Another key element is to make the quality supports and services available in the community. It's really a key element. It's not only about closure. Again, it's really about making sure that person can receive the support that they need and they want in the community. To do so, it has a reallocation of the resources from the institution to the community should be planned, and consider transitional funding in order to create new services while the process of GI is operating. One other advice or recommendation that have been really highlighted is to start with what we call most difficult cases or people with high support needs, because if we start and we succeed with them, it will be easier for anyone else. And so at the beginning, when we start thinking about what kind of support should exist, and when we start developing services, thinking of these with regard to persons who require most of support. Another key element is to use the social capital, which is a very, very important. In different contexts, we have seen that neighbors, local organizations, and extended families are very, very important in supporting the transition and supporting the introduction of these persons in the community life. So just to finish with a few, I will just cite a few practical examples, very concrete examples of things that have been done by our member in Canada, New Brunswick Association in Canada, and another example from Kenya. So New Brunswick Association for Community Living in Canada have been working in supporting people to be included in the community for many years. One thing that they reported is that they have, or the organization offer what they call community facilitators. These persons have the role to link between the person and the community and to facilitate connections between the person and what exists in the community. So they would start with identifying what are the person's interests and what they want to do, meeting with them, discussing with them, and then mapping what exists in the community. And based on the preferences of the person and what they want to do, they will discuss with these different actors that exist in the community to facilitate, to make the connections between the person and the service. It can be a club, it can be an employment, it can be any service in the community. It's very simple, but it can help a lot, in particular for persons who have been institutionalized for many years and who don't know how to start or how to put in practice their preferences and choices. And I would just finish by another example from Kenya, where we know that a lot of circles of support and family peer support exist. So they have the Kaya organization. They have created a couple of years ago, started by creating self-advocacy peer support, where siblings are involved in order to help their member with intellectual disabilities. Families have been trained on supported decision-making, which has been very long trainings in order to really make them understand what do we mean by supported decision-making. And this have helped them to identify how to get the support from what exists in the community. And again, mapping what exists in this community and how we can use it. And what they do is that parents, they do not support their own children, but they link with other members of the family's network to support their own children. So they fund themselves and they do this exchange in order to ensure that if the family is not here anymore, there are all other ways of support that exist in the community itself. So thank you very much. I'm sorry if I've been long, and over to you, Bargabi.
Thanks a lot, Manal. I think the point you made about having policy frames is so important. It sets the frame for those preconditions, both policy-wise as well as in terms of community systems. It's so important, and all of us here have been talking a lot about this. Thank you for those very specific recommendations. Those are most useful. It helps us to prevent mistakes that has happened in the past when deinstitutionalization process is undertaken. I would like now to invite Jared Klein from the International Disability Alliance to speak about his experiences with the human rights mechanisms and how what we are hearing from there on deinstitutionalization. Jared Klein is a human rights advisor at IDA. He's focusing on the Human Rights Council and the World Health Organization. He's a lawyer by training, a former diplomat, and he has experienced mania and institutionalization. Over to you, Jared.
Thank you so much, Bagavi. It's great to be here. So I'm going to talk about deinstitutionalization from the perspective primarily of the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms. Some of the content might be a bit dry or a bit boring, but what I'm really doing is giving the full picture of what states are willing to say on deinstitutionalization as an expression of their understanding to some extent of international human rights law and of their commitments. And what we'll see is that the picture is progressing slowly but surely in a positive direction. So yeah, I'm going to run through some resolutions and some of the key developments. The first point to note, as we all know, the CRPD guidelines on Article 14 and General Comment number 5 on Article 19 are quite clear on what needs to happen. And this is supported by reports from the special procedures of the Human Rights Council and the Special Rapporteur on Health in Report 38/36, the Special Rapporteur on Disabilities in particular in Report 40/54. I'll put links to these reports in the chat later as well. And then further in our ECHR report 34/32 and the Special Rapporteur on Health Report 35/21. All of this outlines a very clear, comprehensive understanding on what needs to happen. But unfortunately, this is not really reflected, these very progressive statements and what we would consider to be a very well-articulated understanding of what the CRPD requires. Those understandings are either not shared by states or they were unwilling to put that in resolution language, much less than actually implement it. So there really is quite a significant gap between a reasonable understanding of the standards and state practice. But in order to create a conducive environment for deinstitutionalization, The International Disability Alliance considers that one necessary step is to generate political will through Human Rights Council, through the international human rights mechanisms. So in 2015, on the resolution on the CRPD, resolution 28/4, the Human Rights Council resolution called on state parties to the convention to prevent isolation or segregation from the community of persons with disabilities and take further measures towards their de-institutionalization, and also to provide persons with disabilities with access to a range of support services that are responsive to their individual choices, wishes, and needs, including for their de-institutionalization. Now, that statement from 2015 is in a way about as far as things have been taken. And most recently in the resolution this year, we come back to something that aligned with that spirit. But in the intervening years, in 2016, there was an initiative started on mental health and human rights. And the perspective there is that it was trying to establish a mandate for reporting and for discussions in the Human Rights Council on how mental health frameworks, laws, and policies can be more strongly aligned with human rights standards, which is very positive. But we'll see as I go through some of the text that there is significant danger, of course, because negotiating these resolutions does allow for states to reinterpret or recast the CRPD articles. And this occurs particularly in relation to some of the more difficult topics, which include the institutionalization. So in resolution 32/18, the council expressed deep concern that persons with psychosocial disabilities and users of mental health services may be subject to discrimination, stigma, prejudice, violence, social exclusion, and segregation. But then they said they're concerned about unlawful or arbitrary institutionalization. And that qualification is quite dangerous because it suggests that there could indeed be lawful and non-arbitrary institutionalization. And that language there does not have the qualifier that institutionalization or deprivation of liberty on the basis of disability is a violation of human rights. It doesn't contain that explicitly or by implication. And that is really against the understanding not only of the previous Human Rights Council resolution by implication, but also the CRPD committee's guidance. But things do move on positively from that resolution, fortunately. That paragraph was repeated in 2017 in resolution 36/13, but resolution 36/13 also had a paragraph which said the following: acknowledging that the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities laid the foundation for a paradigm shift in mental health and created the momentum for deinstitutionalization and the identification of a model of care based on respect for human rights. It goes on a little bit, but that's the key part. So that's an important recognition. It created the momentum. I mean, arguably it creates the obligation. Nonetheless, it's a positive development there. Then in resolution, also in 2017, in resolution 37/22, the CRPD resolution, the council expressed deep concern at negative impact of laws and practices on persons with disabilities, which have a negative impact on the enjoyment of equality and non-discrimination, and allow for the forced institutionalization on the basis of real or perceived disability. So that's a further development of the language of the council in 2017. Then for several years, there was silence, but in resolution 43/13, again on mental health and human rights, it's a slightly strange paragraph. In one sense, it's negative because it recognizes the important role that psychiatry and other mental health professions should have alongside other actors in taking measures to ensure that practices in the field of mental health do not perpetuate stigma, discrimination, and social exclusion, coercion, over-medicalization, and institutionalization that lead to violations or abuses of human rights. Now, for me personally, I have a couple of problems with this language. The first is that it gives a preeminence or a prominence to psychiatry and mental health professions, which is a little bit like asking, I can't remember what's the phrase. It's the wolf guarding the hen house. I don't know what the appropriate metaphor is, but it's giving undue power to an already very powerful group that has historically been responsible for violations of the rights of persons with psychosocial disabilities. But also it says institutionalization that leads to violations or abuses of human rights, but does not recognize that institutionalization is per se a violation of human rights. And then it also repeats the language about unlawful, and another paragraph, in paragraph 6 of resolution 43/13, again talks about unlawful or arbitrary deprivation of liberty and institutionalization. The resolution 43/13 in 2020 contains several negative elements which do not fully account for CRPD standards. But there are positive parts in it though. The final paragraph I mentioned on that resolution, it urges states to promote a paradigm shift in mental health. And it goes on to say, to support, protect, promote, and respect the enjoyment of the rights, autonomy, will, and preferences of all persons, including by providing a range of voluntary supported decision-making mechanisms, peer support, and safeguards against abuse and undue influence within support arrangements over a model based on the dominance of biomedical interventions, coercion, medicalization, and institutionalization. So in a sense, this is the same resolution, bear in mind, and you've got some very good language and some language which is much less strong and clear and positive. So you can kind of see the fine balance that the resolutions do try and walk, but it is after all a product of negotiation by states that do practice coercion still. So it's not a very clear message. So that was in 2020, but then this year, in 2021, in the Human Rights Council 47th session, the resolution on violence against women and girls with disabilities did express concerns with institutionalization in a very important way, much clearer than previously. It expressed deep concern about the negative impact of laws and practices that fail to provide support to persons with disabilities to exercise legal capacity, and concern at discrimination that in some cases deny the right to effective access to justice, and again, that allow for forced institutionalization. And then perhaps the most important paragraph, PP20, expresses concern that forced institutionalization is a form of violence that deprives women and girls of their liberty on the basis of disability, and that in such situations they do face further risk of violations and abuses, including physical, psychological, and sexual and gender-based violence. I think time is a bit against me, but I just did want to stress that resolution has several paragraphs, which I'll put in the chat, that called on states to promote deinstitutionalization and prevent institutionalization, and to integrate a human rights perspective into mental health services by eliminating institutionalization. So it really could not be more clear. And that language is as far as things have gone. The recognition as a form of violence, that forced institutionalization per se, a form of violence and a human rights violation, is a groundbreaking development in terms of the Human Rights Council. Of course, it doesn't go further than the CRPD standards, but this resolution was co-sponsored by around 80 states. It was adopted by consensus, and it's language that I hope we can all use in our advocacy efforts as a clear expression of commitment of states to progress towards or to accelerate the institutionalization measures. Just to say briefly, in the WHO context, it's not a human rights body, but there is some slow but steady positive efforts without anything too clear on deinstitutionalization. They support it seemingly by implication and by talking around the issue, but there's nothing completely 100% clear from the WHO side. So I'm happy to take questions later, but just say the picture is improving, and IDA's working very hard to try and continue to advance the language at the Human Rights Council and other fora. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jared. It's really, it was really very illuminating to know the evolution of the thought process within the United Nations human rights mechanisms. And there is a lot that we can depend on for our advocacy. and particularly the Human Rights Council resolution on violence against women. And I think that there are several concluding observations as well in the specific country context, which have come out with very clear ideas. So, of course, the difficulty is that while all this guidance is there, states parties still find it difficult to implement them. So we hope that the forthcoming guidelines and all the advocacy and the influencing at the national level around the guidelines will help us to reach a place where we wish to go as far as de-institutionalization and CRPD compliant resettlement is concerned. So now thank you so much, Jared, for that. And sorry for the interruption. We, of course, don't know who this person was. And I now request the people from the IMHA to speak. Yeni Rosa, fierce advocate for all kinds of institutionalizations which happens in low-income communities. So I request Yeni Rosa Damayanti from the Indonesian Mental Health Association to speak. Yeni Rosa is a very well-known activist. She's been leading IMHA since a couple of decades, and she's one of the oldest TCI members. Honored to have her here as partner and speaker. Over to you, Yeni Rosa.
Thank you, Bhargavi. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that I can meet you finally here in this very important webinar. I'd like to tell about the situation of institution in Indonesia. Well, for a low-income country like Indonesia, institutions are a little bit different from those in Europe, for example. Most of the institution in Indonesia is in the form of social care institution instead of medical setting institution. So we have two types. One is mental hospitals and another is social care institution. Mental hospitals is under Ministry of Health and social care institution is under Ministry of Social Affairs. Since we adopt universal health coverage, the number of people who detain in the mental hospitals for a long period is declined because the government limit the time of person that can be stay in the hospital for maximum 3 weeks. So most of them after they go out of the hospital are put or dumped in what's called social care institutions. We have hundreds of social care institutions in Indonesia, and the numbers of persons who locked up in these institutions we do not really have the numbers, but I believe it's in the tens of thousands of people. So the condition is very bad because there is no like one regulation and controlling this institution, and many of the residents in this institution are locked are chained by iron chain, and there is no limit how long they are going to be locked up in there. For example, like one institution in Jogja said that they expect the resident to stay in their institution for life, and this institution is a really close up institution. It's more like a prison like institution, so the resident cannot go out of the gate at all. And as long as they are there, and there is no no rules or regulation and on how long they stay there and what is the the mechanism of release, for example. So as long as the family paid for the institution, or as long as the government pay for the institution, and they could be locked up there for the rest of their life. The problem of this is that well, we can say that this is arbitrary detention. This is really arbitrary detention because there is no rules that regulating how the people can be admitted into the institution, and there is no regulation on how to get out of the institution. So this is really like a illegal detention center. Illegal detention center which is approved and approved by the government. the thing that one of the biggest problem of these people to get out of the institution is there are two questions. Where will we live? If we go out of the institution, there is no place to live. If the family refuse them to come back. And the second is how will we eat? Place to stay, things to eat. These two things is the main reason they're stuck in those institutions for years and years and years. As a low-income country, we do not have like a advanced social protection scheme. We do not have like a unemployment benefit. We do not have a disability benefit. We do not have food coupon, for example. We do not have public housing. So those are the things that prevent people from get out of the institution. And those are the things that must be advocate, toward the government, that they have the obligation to provide these things, this facilitation in order in order for the residents to be able to live inclusively in the society. Of course, we cannot do this alone. I mean, based on the context of Indonesia, we cannot do this alone. It is very important in order to advocate for this. We collaborate with other people. In our case, we collaborate closely with cross disability organizations. So this is not only the issue of psychosocial disability. For example, like here we have many friends of from Indonesia that from different disabilities, not psychosocial disabilities, from all over Indonesia, for example. And we also require needs from human rights groups. We need help from the women's groups, and all different movement, different civil society movement to push the government to accept that institution is against disability rights. So this is the first thing that we need to advocate. Social protection scheme is like hand in hand when we talk on the issues of de-institutionalization in Indonesia. Even though this is social care institution, there is forced treatment in those institutions. Some of them have forced psychiatric treatment. And others, they practice more like traditional treatment, but still it is forced. It is not voluntary treatment. From the point of view of low-income country, there's a lot of things to achieve and to advocate in order to achieve this de-institutionalization. First, of course, the government must accept that institutionalizing person with disabilities in these facilities, it is against human rights principle, it is against disability rights. And the second is that force the advocate to the government to prepare to facilitate those things. I kind of like thank COVID-19 is kind of like blessing in disguise, because Indonesian government right now is rewriting their social protection scheme, because they realized during COVID how important it is social protection scheme, and we are now like jump right in, to get involved in this reframing social protection scheme in Indonesia, to make sure that it is involved person with disabilities, that it guarantee that person, especially those who live in the institutions, to get facilities from the government for them after they get out of the institution. Is that my 5 minutes already finished? Okay, thank you very much. We can continue with a Q&A later on. Thank you, Bhargavi.
Thank you so much, Yeni. So Yeni has brought forward, this is a common picture in many low and middle income countries. There is a diverse range of small to large, public and private, medical-based, family-based or community-based lockup facilities where there is no regulation at all. Many countries don't follow any kind of common law regulation of these places either. And then what we need, we clearly have in all these countries, we have a cover for basic needs, particularly social protection, housing and cash transfers. And Yeni has she's working hard, as well as she has brought forth the importance of intersectoral collaborations. So thank you so much for that, Yeni. Now we have grassroots experiences from 2 high-income countries. And I request Anita Abu Bakr, who is the founder and president of NIASA Malaysia, to speak. She's a mental health advocate, self-advocate. She runs a peer support group in Malaysia. Anita is very passionate about fighting stigma and discrimination alongside her peers. She strives for full inclusion for those with psychosocial disability, promoting the recovery model and the human rights-based approach. Over to you, Anita.
Thank you very much, Bhargavi. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. Truly humbled with the invitation. Fairly new in the mental health space. I started the works in 2016 in Malaysia, but we are the first mental health advocacy and peer support group at the moment. So coming to the topic today, de-institutionalization isn't discussed openly in Malaysia because institutions are seen as much needed by mental health professionals and also the ministry. So there's not much effort by the government to move towards. Sorry about that. So like Yeni was mentioning earlier, so in Malaysia, we have 4 big mental institutions, which is definitely owned by the government. And from our national health budget every single year, 1+% is given to mental health. 66%, which is the bulk or the majority of the funds, are given to these 4 big mental institutions. We also have several private settings in Malaysia, which I feel that the intention that it was formed was initially good, but then eventually they practiced a lot of coercion. So it became more like a mini institution, several across the nation. So in the work that we do, obviously, we work closely currently with the different and various disability groups in Malaysia, which, we are often, obviously, we all know, left behind when we put it in the context of human rights and inclusion. However, saying that, many advocacy groups have come up, especially due to this whole pandemic. So very happy to see that, although many individuals as well, which to me, it really helps because every bit is a collective effort, and it will help, the whole mental health space for all of us, really. So just to give you, a little bit of idea on the work that we do. So we actually encourage a lot of conversations, empowering our peers to provide insights on the services that they want instead of being dictated, right? And I think that a lot of times, because in Malaysia, we're still very much framed within the medical model, it's very difficult for a peer to really trust themselves in that process. So a lot of them also feel the need for institutions because alternatives were never presented to them. So they don't really know, where to go if they're not in there. So one of the things that we've done last year, we opened up a safe house, in an activity center and also crisis management center. So it's like a drop-in center where, peers can come in, they can connect, engage meaningfully with others, and then get, whatever support services that they need. So just to give you a little bit of insights, we are basically a one-stop center. We provide many different support systems ranging from either, peer support, safe groups, circle time, circle of care, family intervention, psychoeducation, spiritual therapy, art therapy and programs, workshops, expressive dance therapy, supported employment programs, and job placement. Because what happens in Malaysia a lot is many of our peers, are stigmatized, discriminated in the workplace, and they're not able to sustain their jobs. So we provide this program where we are able to support them to sustain their jobs, work together with the employer, and provide them jobs in an open, competitive environment. So, focusing on their skills and strengths, and supporting them from the beginning until they're able to then, be comfortable in the workplace. But of course, in line with that, whatever support services that they need can, of course, obviously be ongoing. So that's in terms of the clubhouse. And at the current moment, we are working hopefully next year with one of the state governments, because we also want to provide supported accommodation and low cost housing for our peers as a way to create a more sustainable model in the community. One of the good things that has happened via this pandemic is, of course, telehealth. So we have now migrated, actually from last year, all our services online, everything. And so we continue to have now both. So now we've got everything doing it in a physical session and also virtually. So very, very happy that now we're able to reach more people. And of course, we also have our crisis team where we man a 24/7 helpline. And what is unique about our crisis team is because we are able to mobilize the entire team. So if anyone is, in crisis at home or wherever they're at, we are able to be there for them. So I think this is one of the strengths of MIASA, and one of the newest approach that we have also brought about is actually supported volunteering. So before this, none of our volunteers were paid, but now with the private sectors coming in, again, thanks to COVID, the whole pandemic, they are now, wanting to engage with, the civil society, with NGOs, social enterprises, etc. So they have come in and helped us with funding. So now we're able to have, more supported volunteering approaches. And of course, the other thing that we're really strong is support groups. So we've done, Circle Time, Circle of Care support group sessions since January 2017, not just in MIASA, but we've spread it across the nation, where we do it for organizations, universities. We help them to do it, moderate it, set it up, training. So they have safe spaces within, their organizations and wherever they might be. And then, of course, the other thing that we're pushing very much on right now is really converting community centers, because we have a lot of community centers across Malaysia, which is underutilized. When I drive past community centers, you see 2-3 cars. So hopefully, converting these community centers into activity centers, crisis management centers for people with psychosocial disability and people with other disabilities. So that's a little bit of, some of the work that we've done. And just a little bit, the experience of our peers. So what we have, we've gotten a lot of feedbacks from our peers and those that have been in institutions, those that have been in private or mini institutions as well, find it very helpful when they come to MIASA, because, although we don't operate physically 7 days a week, we operate 6 days a week, but because of all the support services activities that we have, they have a place to go where they feel safe and they can, contribute, interact meaningfully with everyone, and they find it very empowering. And now they're, braver, and they feel very encouraged to share their stories and help other people and grow at the same time. So that's a little bit of, the expansion of, support services that we have done in the community. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Anita. I think in our discussions, we've not focused a lot on prevention of institutionalization. I think in many countries, from our experience in Asia Pacific regions, both countries with a colonial history as well as those high income countries have systems of trans-institutionalization and repeated or long enduring institutionalization, what we call the revolving door phenomenon. So prevention of institutionalization with such support systems needs really to be a part of urban planning, and development, and the use of community centers for providing safe spaces for persons with psychosocial or other disability needs is a great idea. Thank you so much. We hope to see more and more of recommendations on examples like yours on comprehensive support systems and social capital, which Manel had mentioned, being available in the communities. So now I request Oyong from South Korea. Oyong Kwon is an old member of TCI. He is the Secretary General of KAMI. He's also a senior partner at the Yale Law Office. And he is a deputy board member at the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry. Welcome, Oyong, and
Thank
over to
you.
you. Yeah.
Thank you, Bhargavi. Good evening. I'm working for Korean Alliance for Mobilizing Inclusion of the Persons with Psychosocial Disabilities. I'm telling barrier of de-institutionalization in Korea, Korean Mental Health Act, and Left Behind from the Korean 2021 de-institutionalization roadmap. We Korean persons with psychosocial disabilities, users and survivors of psychiatry, have been allowed involuntary hospitalization in the psychiatry hospitals from 1997. Korean Mental Health Act has been enacted in 1995 and set forth from December of 1997. From the establishment of the involuntary hospitalization system by the Korean Mental Health Act, the number of the psychiatry hospital beds grew from 30,000 to 90,000 in 20 years, and even the community mental health centers work have been finding persons with mental illnesses in the community to put them to the psychiatry hospitals. The mental health budget grew rapidly. It was 1.7 billion US dollars in 2009, but became more than 8 billion US dollars in a recent year, spent mostly for medical services. Only 1 or 2% of the budget is for psychiatric rehabilitation services. By the Korean Mental Health Act and Disability Welfare Act, persons with psychosocial disabilities are not being included in the disability welfare services because the government officials think if persons with psychosocial disabilities use disability welfare services, the budget for them could be doubled for both medical services and welfare services. So persons with psychosocial disabilities could not participate in the programs by the disability welfare service centers. They only can use the services by the psychiatric rehabilitation centers. With a few Korean lawyers and I made a lawsuit to the Constitutional Court to abolish the involuntary hospitalization system in Korea in 2014, and the court decided the article allowing involuntary hospitalization by consent of the two family carers and medical diagnosis of a psychiatric doctor was not compatible to the right to the freedom of the Article 12 of the Constitution. We also claim the involuntary hospitalization violates the legal capacity of the persons with psychosocial disabilities, but the court did not answer for that. Korean National Assembly revised the Mental Health Act in 2016, which reinforced the safeguard of the involuntary hospitalization procedure, but there were no arrangements for deinstitutionalization and community inclusion. In Korea, the status quo, psychiatric hospitals and mental health professionals don't want persons in the mental hospitals and sanatorium to go out for community living. They lobby the government mental health department and National Assembly members for the profit, and we are excluded from the recent roadmap for roadmap for deinstitutionalization for the people with disabilities living in the institutions. Because deinstitutionalization could bring the change of budget reallocation and power balance between the mental health professionals. I think the deinstitutionalization could be possible by the corporate and strategic efforts by DPOs of the persons with psychosocial disabilities, users and survivors of psychiatry in Asia, with support from United Nations human rights body and international human rights organizations. When the COVID-19 affected Korea in February 2020, the first to 7th dead persons were the hospitalized mental patients in the same closed psychiatric wing in the local area psychiatric hospital. The funeral was the first going out of the first dead person in his 60s by COVID-19, who has stayed in the same psychiatric hospital for 20 years. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Bhargav.
Thanks a lot, Oyong. So happy to have you with us today. And I think, again, I think this is a good entry into the last segment of the program today, where from Oyong we heard, and also in other parts of the Asia Pacific region where we have some experience, we really have to struggle with the authorities and with the legal systems for an extended period of time in order to make even discharge possible, discharge and exit plans possible. There are these very big legal barriers there. And Oyong, like several other speakers, mentioned the question of political will and budgets. That's another very big issue. Very often DPOs and NGOs which are interested in deinstitutionalization do not have the wherewithal to negotiate the systems, or they simply get tired, after years of struggles and not seeing much change. Hope that those things will change. So I invite now Stephen Allen, who's a lawyer and social justice activist, presently co-executive director at Validity Foundation. He was a senior trainer in conflict transformation for over a decade, led programs for young people in conflict with the law in the UK, the Middle East, and India. He served on the independent monitoring board of a young offenders institution in London for 5 years and worked at a charity that successfully campaigned to establish the first children's commissioner for England. So we welcome you, Stephen, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Bhargavi. And good morning, good afternoon, but especially good evening to colleagues from East Asia. I know it's very, very late where you are, and your commitment and power and strength is really inspiring, especially at this time of night, heading towards the weekend. So thank you. And thank you to the team at TCI for the invitation to take part in this, I think, absolutely brilliant discussion. My organization Validity is really honored to partner with you on this series of webinars, and we're really inspired by your leadership and sustained advocacy on this topic. So in my remarks, you heard there that I work in the legal sphere, at least. I'm going to focus on aspects of the legal and political environment that, in our view, can support real deinstitutionalization. Of course, one of the essential preconditions of any effective process of DI is guaranteeing from the outset the leadership and the involvement of persons with disabilities themselves in these processes. And I think organizations such as TCI must be in the driving seat. I also want to applaud the efforts of colleagues from Korea, hearing about the legal action that you have been taking to end involuntary detention and tackling the involuntary treatment of people with psychosocial disabilities. More broadly, this particular series couldn't be more timely. As we've already heard, there's now a major urgency internationally for us to move from principles and norms to action. And 15 years since the adoption of the CRPD, we have a right to be frustrated, especially in the painful knowledge of the damage that has been done due to the failure of many states to move away from institutional forms of care and control. As a legal advocacy organization, Validity is focused on supporting people with disabilities to both claim and enforce those rights that are guaranteed under the CRPD. And we do this through conducting strategic litigation. Here, we seek to identify those systemic barriers, those flaws and inadequacies in public policies and national legal frameworks. And when we've done this, we initiate legal proceedings as a method to promote transformational change. Now, I'm not going to pretend that the law can solve everything, but I think if we start working on the legal system itself, it can actually enable a process of genuine transition to take place. And we are making progress, as you've heard from Korea. So at the center of our work, access to justice is our core focus. And it remains, however, a real challenge for people with disabilities worldwide, and particularly for people with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities. One of the reasons for this is that our legal systems worldwide continue to be premised upon disabling and discriminatory notions, having failed to properly acknowledge people with disabilities as bearers of rights rather than mere objects of care. So I think one of the key legal preconditions in promoting DI is to guarantee and ensure individual and direct access to justice for all persons with disabilities, dismantling the legal and procedural rules which deny them the right to access the courts. As Manel said, we need to recognize people's right to legal capacity in all areas of their lives. Otherwise, we simply will not achieve the transition that we seek. And indeed, while our organization takes cases across Europe and Africa to promote inclusion in the community, most frequently our biggest legal battle is persuading the courts to hear people with disabilities themselves in the first place, trying to encourage them that their legal claims must be registered in the first place, and trying to tell judges not to fall into the trap of listening to everyone else who claims to represent the best interests of people with disabilities. It follows, therefore, that these legal and procedural barriers to access to justice must be removed. The legal environment will never be conducive to independent living for people with disabilities until it first recognizes the crucial importance of providing access to the courts. Beyond this, we often see that national DI strategies falter due to the absence of conducive legislative and policy environments at the national level. Often, the focus of national policies is too narrow, and DI strategies are seen merely as policy processes related to the social care or healthcare sectors, as opposed to a core cross-governmental obligation, which is focused on promoting human rights. It's no surprise then that DI strategies fail when they are focused mainly on the closure of institutions alone. In the imagination of policymakers, institutions are just big old buildings holding hundreds of people. And quite often these policymakers fall into the trap of thinking that their goal should just be to close them or even replace them with smaller buildings, and that's the end of the story. This premise is wrong. The institutionalization isn't about buildings. Indeed, the continuing use of the word itself, the institutionalization, in my view, can present a barrier to the type of imagination that is really needed on how to transform our communities. Bluntly, DI shouldn't be our goal, nor should it be the goal of law or policy. It is simply a set of interconnected processes that need to be focused on a much broader and clearer goal, namely the repatriation of autonomy, choice, and control of people with disabilities about how they live their lives, where they live, and with whom they decide to live. It is here that I think the principles of universal design, in fact, can inspire a far more comprehensive approach to the types of law and policy reform that we need and which are conducive to genuine inclusion. We need to start with the basics, understanding the barriers that people face in exercising their rights and dismantling them, but also crucially developing new systems of support which enable people to live with dignity and autonomy. This transformation entails imagination and, as you've heard, high-level political leadership. Indeed, nothing short of a redefinition of the essence of the relationship between persons with disabilities and the state, a new social contract. It follows that this kind of shift is far more fundamental than moving people out of big institutions and putting them in adapted houses. Instead, a systematic process of law and policy reform is required on a cross-governmental basis. We need to be talking about housing and employment. We need to be talking about widening and expanding access to core public services at the community level. And we need also to prioritize the participation of people with disabilities in public debate and public life. Now, it doesn't escape me that the wide-ranging nature of these shifts are daunting, especially in those of our societies that have long histories of social segregation of people with disabilities. But building on the principle of universal design, I want to spend the last couple of minutes putting forward what I think are some of the legal scaffolding that might help us onto a better path. Firstly, non-discrimination. We need to start by strengthening legal protections against discrimination on the basis of disability. Indeed, we need to push for the legal recognition that institutionalization itself amounts to discrimination on the basis of disability. This legislative change would have a transformative and systemic impact, enabling people to challenge their incarceration in institutions as a prohibited form of discrimination, and could prompt public services to take the demands of people with disabilities far more seriously. Secondly, the principle of non-discrimination in law is mirrored by the more positive general obligation on state parties to the CRPD to ensure equality, both in terms of procedure as well as outcome. If we can gain legislative acknowledgement of the right to equality for persons with disabilities, this legal mechanism can open up a far more concrete route for people with disabilities to enforce their rights to the sorts of individualized supports and reasonable accommodations that are necessary for them to exercise their independence. Indeed, we should consider the denial of support and reasonable accommodation not as just neglect, but amounting to prohibited discrimination in itself. In pushing for these reforms, I think we can take inspiration from the powerful and transformative effect that the judgment in Olmsted, for example, in the USA had on the fight for independent living. Third, while non-discrimination and equality are, in our view, essential components of a conducive legislative environment, we need to think about how to bring these norms to life in the day-to-day practice of policymakers in public institutions. To tackle this general passivity and inertia, we can also advocate for a cross-cutting public service equality duty. Broadly speaking, this would mean imposing a legal obligation on all public authorities to proactively assess and ensure that their policies really are promoting equality and inclusion in reality, and that they prevent direct and indirect forms of discrimination. We can ground such a public service equality duty in the principle of universal design, promoting the necessity of disability impact assessments across government and beyond the classic fields of just health and social care. And fourthly, given the complexity and the nature of the task at hand, we should also consider advocating for the strengthening of focal points for the CRPD in each country. As I mentioned earlier, achieving a genuinely conducive environment for independent living requires vision and leadership and the direct involvement of people with disabilities. The text of the CRPD calls for governments to establish coordinating bodies within each country, but we know that these bodies are often small, underfunded offices, subsidiary to classic ministries of health or social care, and they don't have the weight they need to push interministerial and cross-governmental coordination. Our task then is to advocate for focal points on disability rights and DI to get a far higher billing, such as at the cabinet level position within governments. Fifth, I also think we can't move forward on DI without owning and acknowledging the harms of the past. Instead, we need to advocate for recognition that institutionalization has caused severe, widespread, and systematic violations of the human rights of persons with disabilities for generations. And we need to call for legal recognition and reparations for these harms. Now, this might sound like a distant goal, but I think we are now on the cusp of a global awakening as to the terrible impact of institutionalization on persons with disabilities, in part due to the horrors we have all seen during the pandemic. As the old saying goes, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. By the same token, we can now confidently say that the path to mass suffering of persons with disabilities during the pandemic was paved with the paternalistic notion that locking people in would protect them. Let us all call for public acknowledgement that this was wrong, and instead push for reparations, habilitation, and rehabilitation for persons with disabilities. I think by taking this sort of line, we're sharpening our arguments and will push the legal environment to recognize that independent living and inclusion in the community are in fact essential to repair many of the harms of the past. So to sum up, my argument is that we need to think far more systematically than many policymakers naturally do in order to build this conducive political, legal, and policy environment, one which is clearly focused on the goal and not merely the process of deinstitutionalization itself. At this point, I want to thank you again and all of our colleagues for coordinating this crucially important discussion. And I very much look forward to continuing to work with you all on transforming our communities so that they're really inclusive of all. Validity stands ready to work on any of your legal advocacy initiatives and support those. And we very much hope that we are going to be part of a movement of genuine change in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And that was so powerful and inspiring. Thank you very much. You know, we really struggled with what to do with legal systems, and your presentation presents a ray of hope that it is still possible to wade through that system and arrive at some place. We are particularly interested in, in seeing what are the legal possibilities of realizing Article 19, the right to live in the community. And the principle of universal design that you so eloquently talked about was really very useful. And I hope that those will also be captured in many of the advocacy documents, which will no doubt come out of our initiatives and the larger systemic initiatives that are coming forth from the United Nations and elsewhere. So thank you so much for that. I think to talk about principles of universal design, whether in terms of legal preconditions or community-based preconditions, is a wonderful way of catching the spirit and the practicality of all that we have discussed today. And we will close because we run the risk of of overshooting our time by several minutes. We do have a closing video from Vladimir Chuk, Executive Director of the International Disability Alliance. I request Wakar now to share the video.
Let me begin by congratulating. Hi, my name is Vladimir Chuk, and I'm Executive Director of the International Disability Alliance. Let me begin by congratulating TCI for the campaign What We Need and for organizing this very timely webinar series. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. Despite some initiatives for the institutionalization of persons with disabilities in different places throughout the years, institutionalization remains spread throughout the world, perpetuating the segregation and invisibility of persons with disabilities and depriving those institutionalized of their freedom and of any choice and any prospect of developing a life plan of their own. Decades of scientific research and human rights monitoring of institutions, both disability-specific and or mainstream, have shown their negative impacts. Violence, exploitation, abuse, degrading treatment, inhumane conditions, lack of privacy, you name it. We are all aware nobody can plead ignorance. Yet sometimes such serious violation within institutions divert the attention and make people miss the main point. Institutionalization itself is the systematic human rights violation perpetuated by states. Institutional inertia and lack of political will to address the status quo. This clearly needs to change. Since the adoption and almost universal ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, states must take action. The institutionalization does not require only to look at and dismantle the institutions, but also we need to look at our communities and precisely respond to your question of what we need to improve them, for communities to be more inclusive and supportive of all their members. The UN CRPD provides some responses. For example, Article 12 on equal recognition before the law calls for reforming current legal environment so that the will and preferences and the right to free and informed consent of persons with disabilities are duly respected. While a first focus is in reforming the law, awareness of all needs to be raised for ensuring respect of decision-making practice. Article 19 on the right to live independently and be included in the community requires that persons with disabilities, including those with psychosocial disabilities, are provided with support, such as personal assistance, peer support, responsiveness of services, and much more. The momentum should not be lost. The COVID-19 pandemic raised attention of the broad audience to this systematic human rights violation. In 2020, the report by the COVID-19 Disability Rights Monitor, of which IDA was part, brought about key evidence coming from persons with disabilities worldwide. Consequently, the UNCRPD Committee has decided to embark on a process to develop a set of guidelines for the institutionalization to provide states more concrete recommendations than ever before. In a way to support states to move forward, but also suggesting that excuses are no longer acceptable. IDA and other organizations, including TCI, support this process, which included unprecedented regional consultations with persons with disabilities, and in which there will be more opportunities to provide inputs. We hope that this process will lead to more concrete action at national levels. And all of us that are part of the disability movement will be committed to monitor, remind, and demand action. I wish you a very successful webinar series, and we remain in collaboration and in support of your colleagues of TCI and persons with disabilities in the region. All the best.
Yes. Thanks a lot for that, Vladimir. So, Vakar, would you like to come in here and close the session? Thank you so much for the support.
Yes, thank you so much. I would just like to close the session now and say thanks to all the speakers, to interpreters, Amresh, to Kelly. Thank you for your support today. And we will keep you posted about the upcoming webinars. Two of them are scheduled in November and one is scheduled in December. So we'll keep you posted. Have a good day. Have a good evening. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. See you later in the next webinar.
Thank you. Thank you, Bhargavi, Wakar, and everyone. Good night. I mean, good night from Malaysia.
Good night from Bali.
Indonesia.
Yes.
Bye, Yani.
Bye-bye.
Bye, and
Terima kasih ya teman-teman dari Indonesia udah pada nongol.
Oh, teman-teman dari Indonesia, selamat malam.
Ya, udah banyak, beberapa udah ini kali ya. Ini ada teman baru dari Malaysia. Kapan-kapan kita.
Ya, boleh mampir ke rumah ya, makan-makan. Ya, assalamualaikum. Bye.